This episode of the Best Armies of 40k is sponsored by Wicked Dicey's Summer Slaughter GT. Check the links in the video description to register and get some games in of 11th edition Warhammer 40k. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another episode of the Best Armies in Warhammer 40k, the weekly video series where we go through undefeated lists from the past week of competitive play and talk about what is winning. And I am just back from the Geekdom Con GT, where I live streamed all 5 games of that event. There were some absolute nail-biter games on the stream, showcasing some insane builds and awesome play. So check out my live coverage of that event, and I'm going to be talking about the winner of that event in this video. Now, this episode is for the weekend of May 23rd and 24th, 2026, and this is an interesting weekend because we did see a lot of GT play. However, we had several super major level events. That includes the Bristol Super Major as well as the German Super Major, both of which are not yet complete. They are actually still ongoing, likely at the time that you are watching this video. So we may do a follow-up episode later this week talking about the winners of those events. They're both somewhere around between 250 and 300 if they have interesting results. With that, moving over to a metagame breakdown, we can see that our top dogs remain Chaos Space Marines, who did incredibly well, taking down the ValleyCon 2026 High Voltage Havoc GT Storm of Silence with a undefeated record, but not necessarily top. They were, I believe, 3rd place, but there were 3 undefeateds in that event. The CTC Championship Open, Anniversario Art Hobbies, Midwest Conquest, as well as both 1st and 2nd place at Exterminatus 2026. Now, not 100% of these lists are using Defilers or Pact-Bound Zealots, and we'll talk about a couple of interesting ones that chose to go different directions. Now, we also see Necrons kind of coming back in a big way with wins at the Bay Area Open, going undefeated there, the Storm of Silence, Iberian Open Cosecha de Cranios, and Warzone Atlanta. That last one was only 7 rounds and ended with an X and 1 in the final result. We also saw Tau Empire continuing to do fairly well at High Voltage Havoc as well as Geek plus Pop. Orks kind of came out of the woodwork to have a good weekend, taking down the Geekdom GT that I live streamed, as well as going undefeated at Flesh, Faith, and Steel, both with 2 extremely unexpected detachments, both taking the new character Wazdaka Gutsmech. That guy's really, I guess, sort of made a big impact on how the faction is designed. We did also see Leagues of Votann with 2 undefeated results at the Storm of Silence and Incarnatus 2. Astra Militarum took down the Shizhou Buccaneers Open and Thailand GT Summer. Thousand Suns also went undefeated with a 5-0 result at the Geekdom GT, but also won the Salzburg Major Singles. Deathwatch took down the Dirg Doom 7. Ultramarines won the Minsk Eternal GT. Raven Guard won Heroes of the Mid-Table Spring. Adeptus Mechanicus took down the 11th Hour GT. Emperor's Children also went undefeated at the Thailand GT Summer, taking 2nd place there. Imperial Knights went undefeated at the ValleyCon 2026. Geneastealer Cults won the Bay Area Open, going 6-0 and taking 1st place at that event. And last but certainly not least, the winner of one of the largest events of the weekend that we're talking about today anyway, the Warhammer Open in Dallas. That was won by Liam VSL, running a bizarre and unique Drukhari build. And with that, we're going to hop into these lists just after a word from our sponsors. Have you ever wanted to be ruthlessly and brutally slaughtered? Well, I have good news for you because the date of your execution is set to August 14th through 16th, 2026 in Plainsboro Township, New Jersey. And that's because this video has been sponsored by Wicked Dicey and their event, The Slaughter. This represents the return of a long-running event that saw its rebirth last year. I was there, I live streamed it, and it was a great time. It includes a 5-round Warhammer 40,000 grand tournament, as well as events for Age of Sigmar, Star Wars Legion, and many other games. On top of that, Wicked Dicey always goes out of their way to put on a great show, creating a
fun and inclusive convention atmosphere, so even if you're just participating in a tournament, there are plenty of other things to do and people to hang out with the entire weekend. And they always work extensively with local tournament organizers to ensure that all of their events for all of their games are fair and well run. So if you're looking for any gaming action this summer, I highly recommend you check out Wicked Dicey's Slaughter. You can find more information in the links on the video right here or in the video description to get your tickets today. So starting as usual with Chaos Space Marines, we're going to head on over to the Storm of Silence, a 117 player event. And talking about the third place finisher, Zach Starcher. Now, despite being a 117 player event, it only ran 5 rounds, so there were 3 undefeated at the end of the day. Now, in this case, Zach was playing a Pact-bound Zealot list. There were a couple of interesting pieces of technology in here, but for the most part, we are seeing a lot of what we've seen before. This includes Abaddon the Despoiler, Cypher, and Huron Blackheart. We also have the Masters of the Maelstrom in there as a undivided unit. We do have chosen squads to attach both the Masters of the Maelstrom and Abaddon into 2 separate units. What's interesting is that both chosen units are Chaos Undivided marked. I don't know necessarily if there might have been an event ruling about how the Masters of the Maelstrom interact with Cult Marks of Chaos. The weird thing about them is that they are already undivided marked, so when they join a unit, they can actually basically apply the Mark of Chaos Undivided in addition to whatever mark it already currently has, which is probably an oversight in the rules, but it may have been ruled around. But that, for example, lets the unit attach undivided characters and enter into undivided rhinos in addition to applying its other effects. Now, we also do have an undivided Rhino to carry some of those guys around. We do have a Nurgle Kael'thas Mob unit for some backline support, in addition to a Chaos Biker squad, also Mark of Nurgle for utility. From there, we have 2 Defilers, both Mark of Nurgle plus a Hellbrute, so we're full in on the Hellbrute combo for this list. That means that these guys are going to be getting critical 5-ups when you pray with ranged attacks for sustained hits. The Hellbrute then also applies lethal hits in addition to their sustains, and then Abaddon gives you rerolls to try to reroll all of those in order to get more conversions. In this case, all the Defilers are equipped with Hades Las Cannons, and Excruciator Cannons, and Ectoplasma Destructors. We then have a bunch of Corsair Raiders, which is actually pretty interesting. So it's 3 total units of Red Corsairs. These are the 3 OC infiltrating infantry. 2 of them are taking Mark of Slaanesh, so you can use them as kind of aggressive disruption pieces. They're high base OC characteristic, and with advance and charge from the Mark of Slaanesh, being able to use the stratagem, Impact by Zealots, you can get them to enemy objectives fairly easily. The 3rd unit with Mark of Nurgle is interesting because you can use Festering Miasma to keep them safe from return fire shooting. So being able to infiltrate into an aggressive spot and then potentially make it to an objective and prevent your opponent from shooting them allows you to get up on primary pretty quickly there. Otherwise, there wouldn't really be that much of a reason to take Mark of Nurgle onto these utility units, these kind of melee-oriented utility units. Now, sticking with Chaos Space Marines for a moment, we're going to go and head on over to Exterminatus 2026, which was held in Queensland, Australia, a 42-player GT. This went 5 rounds, and actually both first and second place were won by Chaos Space Marines. However, one of these Chaos Space Marine lists is not like the other, because the second place finisher, Marty Elliott, was running Nightmare Hunt, the Battleshock Matters kind of Raptor-focused detachment. Now, in this case, he was focusing extremely heavily on jump infantry as well as characters. Notably, there are no Defilers in this build. Instead, the list is using 2 Chaos Vindicators for some backline shooting. However, the other piece of technology that it uses is the ability to bring allied Cult Legions in, and in this case, take 2 units of Noise Marines. That's because Noise Marines give you a -1 to Battleshock checks when they shoot you with their gun, and Nightmare Hunt being the Battleshock Matters detachment, that's very helpful. This detachment specifically forces enemies to take a -1 Battleshock check if they're below starting strength in their Battleshock step, rather than if they are below half strength. And if they do end up being Battleshocked, they get -1 to hit you, you get +1 to wound them, and if they already are below half strength, you also get +1 to your hit rolls as well. So you can combo off of forcing these Battleshock checks, and there's a couple ways that we can force enemies to take them. Now, the Noise Marines are going to compound with that, obviously, so you could potentially be getting -2 to Battleshock
shock checks in addition to any other potential modifiers that you can stack. Raptors explicitly also force an additional -1 to battle shock checks, so within 6 inches, and they force battle shock checks in the start of the fight phase. So we can, in many cases, be forcing -2, or in some cases even -3 battle shock checks, which at that point is a very reasonable chance that you start to see leadership 5 or 6 failing more often than not. Now, the list is also taking all 3 enhancement slots. We have a Chaos Lord with Terror Glut Parasite that forces an additional -1 battle shock check on something he's engaging at the start of the fight phase. That can potentially be forcing battle shock checks in addition to the ones being forced by Raptor units already, and that is on a Foot Chaos Lord who doesn't naturally have the ability to force those checks. Now, combining with him, we have Cypher as well as 2 Jump Pack Chaos Lords. One of them has Warp Field Thrusters, which gives him an up-down he can use every turn. This is a good combination with the stratagem Horrific Incursion, which allows him to force an additional -1 leadership battle shock check on something when he arrives in your movement phase out of reserve. So if he can up-down at the end of your opponent's turn, he then hops back in and he chooses something within 12 inches for 1 command point and forces a battle shock check. Now, because he's a Chaos Lord, he also gets a free stratagem every battle round, so he may potentially be doing that for free if you haven't used that already. The other Lord has Sorrow Scent Vulture, which gives him 6-inch scout and the ability to attach into Warp Talons. Warp Talons are already a move 12 jump infantry unit. Being able to 6-inch scout them means they can move potentially 18 inches out of your deployment zone on the top of 1, and then getting a free stratagem from the Chaos Lord, they could use a Malicious Surge to then advance and charge. So their potential threat range is 18 plus 3d6 inches off the deployment line, top of 1. So that allows them to very easily access any utility units in the center of the battlefield, but they could also potentially just dive into something in your deployment zone if you do set up particularly close to them. Warp Talons then, obviously, as long as they destroy something and remain unengaged at the end of the fight phase, can then just jump into reserve, rapid ingress, and continue to do that, most of which can be done for free using the Chaos Lord. Now, it's a lot of stress on the Chaos Lord's ability to discount stratagems, but we are going to need to get as much mileage from that as possible. From there, we're running 2 units of Legionaries, as well as a Cultist mob, 2 Chaos Rhinos to carry those guys around, the aforementioned 2 Chaos Vindicators for shooting support. There's very little synergy in the detachment with the Vindicators themselves. They do get the benefits of the detachment ability, but mostly they're just relying on their own base profile and the fact that they can potentially, in some cases, be +1 to hit or wound, depending on what they're targeting. However, most of the stratagems require targeting on an infantry unit. Speaking of which, we also then have 2 units of Raptors and the aforementioned 2 units of Noise Marines as well. Pretty wild build, and it's always cool to see these really off-meta detachments doing well. Now, with that, we're going to move on over to the Bay Area Open, one of the larger events of the weekend, a 161-player major held in California to discuss Necrons and Marshall Peterson's Canoptek Court. Now, in this case, Marshall was playing a list that was focused very heavily on the combination of Plasmancers and Immortals. Essentially, the entire list was baked around that, and then backed up by a couple of Catan shards. Canoptek Court typically buffs Cryptek and Canoptek units. However, with the introduction of the Canoptek Tomb Crawlers, you can now apply the Canoptek keyword to essentially any unit, including a Cryptek, which allows almost all of the synergies within Canoptek Court to apply to units with Crypteks inside them. Previously, you could attach Cryptothralls into these units, but they did not have the Canoptek keyword, so the Tomb Crawlers are pretty transformative in this way. They also occasionally have the ability to ignore hit modifiers if you are close enough to the target. Now, in this case, we're playing 2 Catan shards, the Catan shard of the Deceiver as well as the Nightbringer to do some heavy lifting. We have Illuminor Ceres and Necrosaur Amintar, who are both pretty important, in addition to 3 Plasmomancers, one with Metallodernal Tesla Weave, which can deal damage in response to enemies charging the unit. So if you're playing a little bit more aggressively and your opponent's coming in, you can inflict some random passive damage to them. In addition to that, we also have 3 Royal Wardens. Now, the Royal Wardens fulfill a couple of roles in here. First of all, they are going to attach into immortal units. They themselves possess a relatively appreciable ranged attack. Rapid fire 2, lethal hit, strength 5, AP 1, 2 damage, gunshot, which is nice, but they also give you the ability to fall back and shoot, so getting engaged in melee isn't necessarily the biggest deal. Now, the central recipients of this combo are going to be the 3 units of Immortals in the army. These can attach the Plasmanters, which can dual attach alongside the Royal Wardens. The Immortals are all equipped with Gauss Blasters, so that is their standard lethal hit weapon, 2 shot, strength 5, AP 1 for 1 damage. And the Plasmanters give them improved critical hits, so they're then going to be triggering that lethal hits on 1 better than normal. Now, the benefit of the Canoptech Court is that you get the Power Matrix mechanic, where your Cryptek units gain rerolls if you are controlling an area of the battlefield. So if you have majority control of objectives in no man's land or a player deployment zone, then you'll get hit rerolls. That allows you to fish for those 5-up critical hits on the immortal units to gain those lethal hits. Now, Necrosaur Amintar also gives these units sustained hits when they target the closest eligible target. And the Immortals also gain wound rerolls if they target an enemy on an objective. So if the stars align and they get all of these effects, they target an enemy on an objective while within their power matrix, while within range of all of their abilities. Plus, Illuminor Ceres is also in here, who's going to give them an Armor of Contempt effect and a +1 AP. Plus, Canoptech Court has access to Solar Pulse to drop cover off of enemies to make that low AP characteristic go farther. You're going to be shooting AP2, ignore cover, full reroll, hit and wound, critical 5-ups, lethal, and sustain. That is in addition to the Plasmancer also dealing damage. He has a gunshot as well, and he can also do a little grenade effect to deal some mortal wounds. Plus, the Royal Warden is firing another 4 of those whip profile with 2 damage instead of 1. So these units, for not a massive points investment, 250 points or so, depending on the size of the Immortal Squad, can deal some legitimately impressive damage, and then you can follow that up with the very strong baseline profiles of the Catan Shards. Now, in order to facilitate this as well, we also have units of Canoptech Tomb Crawlers. I guess those guys should be included in the unit cost, so it is closer to 300 points. So it does get a little pricey. We have a Canoptech Reanimator to keep these guys alive, as well as 1 unit of Ophidian Destroyers. Those Ophidian Destroyers are pretty important not only for scoring secondaries, but also so that Necrosaur Amintar can hop in and not just be shot immediately, so he can actually gain his Lone Operative. Illuminor Ceres can gain Lone Operative from basically anyone, but Amintar does require some help there. So clearly, going 6-0 with this list, the Immortal damage output with all of these stacked buffs was good enough to push through a lot of defensive profiles. Now, what's really interesting is that the expense of these Immortal squads allowed them to perform well enough to go undefeated, even without the use of a lot of utility units. So there's very little natural utility in the army, although obviously a lot of stuff can pull dual purpose if it needs to. And there's no real frontline besides the Catan Shards. Oftentimes you'll see warriors, or you'll see, especially in Canoptech Court, you'll see wraiths, for example, as a resilient objective holder, but we don't really have that in this build. So it likely plays a much more aggressive playstyle than the more passive playstyle we see from many Necron lists that are just putting these bricks onto objectives and hoping to counterpunch the opponent when they overcommit to try to remove them. Now, moving on from there, we're going to go all the way over to the Philippines for the Geek Plus Pop event. This was a game convention that held a 6-round, 51-player 40k GT within it, and that was won by Aegis Duran, who was playing a Tau Montka list. In this list, Aegis was playing a Firesight team with Strategic Conqueror. That's helpful because that guy is a lone operative, so he's relatively difficult to get rid of. He can sit in the back and operate as a little bit of a fire support platform, but also just as a marker light applicator as well. And then that Strategic Conqueror means that as long as he's on the battlefield, you get +1 OC when controlling one particular objective, usually one of the objectives in the center, or either you or your opponent's expansion objective, depending on how aggressive you feel like you need to be in that particular matchup. So he can just sort of passively accrue that value over the course of the game. We also have the Twin Lance in there because they're great. 1 Breacher team, as well as a Devilfish to deliver them in the early game. a Ghost Keel battlesuit for some midboard control, in addition to 2 Hammerhead gunships. Now, one of these is playing an ion cannon, which is obviously massively improved by the lethal hits you get from the early game of the detachment ability. The other one is rocking a railgun, so 2 separate weapon systems on both of those Hammerhead gunships. Also, both of them playing accelerator burst cannons instead of smart missile systems, which I think is neat. But the railgun is good in the late game. After your early game lethal hits peter out, you then have one high impact shot that doesn't necessarily get much benefit from lethal hits that can still work relatively consistently over the course of the game. Obviously, a railgun is like the definition of an inconsistent weapon, but it is nice to have a weapon that's not relying on those lethal hits. We then have 2 units of Pathfinders, a Piranha, 3 Riptide battlesuits, 2 units of Stealth battlesuits, and a Vespid Stingwing squad. A lot of relatively standard stuff for Tau. And that moves us on over to the Geekdom GT, the event that I live streamed over the course of the weekend. This was a 45-player GT being held in Pennsylvania in the USA, and was won by Derek Apshay from the 40k Dirtbags YouTube channel. In this case, Derek was playing a wild list, a Cult of Speed, the orc detachment focused on bikers and fast vehicles that allows you to fall back, advance, shoot, and still charge all game-wide with all of those units, which is a wildly powerful detachment ability. Now, in this case, Derek was playing a Boss Necrons, 2 Deathkiller Wartrikes, one of them with Squighide Tires, which allows 6-inch consolidation moves, which is helpful for gaining purchase on objectives. We also had Waz Blasta on another Deathkiller Wartrike, which gives him a shoot and scoot ability, allows him to move his unit after they attack. We then also had Wazdaka Gutsmech, the new biker character, as well as a Weird Boy and Zodgrod Wartsnaga. There was a unit of 10 boys for the Weird Boy to join into. These guys were used largely as a utility unit and a bunch of sort of just a brick of objective control. They would start on the home objective early and then teleport themselves around the table in order to obsec objectives behind the meat of the orc push forward. We then had a ton of warbikers. Another benefit of the detachment is that warbikers become battle lines, so you're able to take up to 6 of them. And in this case, Derek was playing 3 units of 6 and then 3 units of 3 for utility. At only 65 points with a relatively resilient defensive profile, they have 2 3-wound models, as well as 1 4-wound model for the smaller units. Plus, they have not unreasonable shooting. Once they're in rapid fire and targeting the closest enemy, they get to AP 1 and shoot 6 shots per model. It's not great, but the list actually had some pretty reasonable anti-light infantry shooting, so it was able to clear screens and things pretty well without having to commit to melee. And then they're also fairly good in melee and extremely fast. These guys oftentimes started in reserve in order to hop in and either rapid ingress to go threaten objectives or just to jump in off the sides of the table, protect themselves with terrain, and then follow up the bigger units pushing early on. There's then the central core of any Cult of Speed list, which is 18 Defcoptas. We also had a unit of 10 Gretchen for backline control, a unit of 20 Gretchen for Zodgrod Wartsnaga to hop into, and 2 Shock Jump Dragstas. The Shock Jumps are kind of an interesting inclusion. They do have not terrible shooting. They have a rocket launcher in addition to a 3+ ballistic skill of Strength 8, D6 plus 1 damage, precision devastating attack, which in some cases can just kill your characters randomly, which is really annoying. And sometimes they just roll 6s and do devastating wounds. The big thing, though, is that they teleport themselves around the table when they go to advance, so it's another set of units that can effectively reposition themselves around wherever they need to. So they, alongside the Orc Boys, give you a ton of flexibility on where you actually position your models. And the entirety of the list played basically like a wave attack. It's classic Orc fashion. Early game, on either Battle Round 1 or early Battle Round 2, you would declare a WOG. The Zodgrod Wartsnaga is the only unit that really gets the big benefit of the WOG. You get a once per game advance and charge, but obviously all of the Cult of Speed units don't need that. It does improve their damage output and their survivability, but the big benefit is that it gives Zodgrod that 5+ invulnerable save in addition to plus 6 inches of movement for his unit. So if your opponent doesn't screen it out, he can WOG really early, turn 1 or turn 2, use his scout move, then move 12 plus an advance plus a charge to basically jail you in your own deployment zone. That gives the rest of the mounted units a turn to set up, so they can push all of the bikers and things into the middle of the table. They're then protected by that invulnerable save as well, and they can follow up the turn after. Sometimes you'd also get a unit or 2 of them into melee on the same turn. So you would essentially be able to jail your opponent very early early game into their own deployment zone, set up all of the war bikers on all the objectives in the mid-board, and then the turn after that, because all those war bikers can still advance and charge, they would just push up into the spaces left by the previous screen, and it would jail you over and over and over again. The third wave would then be the Defcoptas, which would deep strike in or hop in with advance and shoot, and they would deal damage to larger targets. Generally speaking, the army essentially lost very hard on attrition. All of the warbikers would push forward and mostly die, but it didn't matter so much because they were just preventing you from getting to objectives physically with the size of the army. All of these large base models are absolutely massive. And then even if you're able to push forward through all of that beef, there are still the boys squad as well as the shock jump dragstas that can apply OC and the random utility units that can apply OC to the objectives throughout the game. But then you also have some spot removal in the form of Wazdaka Gutsmack. Because he can turn on his ability to auto-advance 6 inches, he can move 20 inches and still shoot and charge. He has a pretty reasonable shooting profile. He shoots 12 strength 6 AP2 2 damage Gatling shots, plus his own 3 damage Draga Claw attack. So he himself can sort of run around and finish off units that the Defcoptas are dealing with, while then also being able to charge in later on. And any positions that are opened up from the war bikers going down, he's able to sort of fulfill those. He doesn't usually commit early. He comes in later in the game in order to knock down larger targets that are actually going to threaten the bikers. But generally speaking, it just sort of enacts this jail game plan where it prevents you from getting to the objectives for the first 2 to 3 turns of the game. And by that point, the Orc player's up 20 to 30 points on primary, and it's very difficult to come back at that stage from that deficit. And obviously that worked out because Derek was able to go 5-0, winning all of his games. Now we're going to stick with Orcs for a sec here and move on over to the Flesh, Faith, and Steel event that Orcs also went undefeated in this case being piloted by Shane Mays. Flesh, Faith, and Steel was a 25-player event also being held in Australia. Warhammer 40k was definitely a global hobby this week. There were events all over the world, which is super cool to see. Now, in this case, Shane was playing a Freeboota crew detachment, which is a detachment that I know significantly less about. Not only did I not stream this event, but I also have never seen anyone play it. This is the digital release detachment that lets you choose an objective marker in your command phase. I think this actually was originally released at working at the start of the battle round, which is a very strange timing, ended up being changed. It then gives you sustained hits 1 for your infantry, mounted, or walker units when targeting enemies on that objective, or while you yourself is on the objective. In this case, Shane was playing a beast boss with the captain enhancement that gives him a commissar style of ability where he can deal mortal wounds to people within 12 inches to unbattle shock them. That's going to be pretty good in 11th edition, I think. We had Gazgul Thraka as well as Wazdaka Gutsmech and a standard mech as well. Wazdaka Gutsmech is a vehicle, but weirdly also mounted. So he does get the effect of the detachment ability, which does allow him to get sustained hits 1 while charging onto the loot objective. So he could be swinging his big strength 10 lance attack with sustained hits, which is kind of horrifying. We then have a unit of Beast Snagga boys as well as a unit of standard boys, 20 in each of those, with 2 battle wagons to deliver them to the fight. These big units can get the benefit of Bash and Grab, which allows you to gain full wound rerolls targeting enemies in range of your loot objective. And so especially for big units like the Beast Snagga boys with improved strength, the Beast Boss also gains devastating wounds, and that's in addition to the sustained hits you're already getting from the detachment ability. These things can actually do some pretty serious damage. The detachment also has a reactive move that triggers when enemies fall back from them. So one play pattern that you could enact is using these massive, huge boys units to engage multiple enemies, forcing them to fall back in order to open up shooting activations on those boy squads, and then using the reactive move to then pile them back into their battle wagon to protect them. I don't know for sure if that was a play pattern that was used here, but it's certainly one that's available. Following that up is a unit of 10 flash gits. There is an anti-vehicle 4+ stratagem keyed to flash gits in this detachment, so these guys could do some actually pretty serious anti-tank damage if the stars are aligned for them. We have 2 units of Gretchen to hold down objectives and generate command points, a commando squad, as well as 2 units of Storm Boys for utility, plus 2 units of Tank Bustas for some anti-vehicle work. Super cool list, and it's always cool, as I've said before, to see these off-the-wall detachments seeing success. Now we're going to head back over to the Storm of Silence event to talk about Leagues of Votann. The event was eventually won by Sweet Lou, who was playing a Hearthband list. This included Buri Agnirson, 2 Khals, as well as Uthar the Destined. We had a unit of Hearthkin warriors in addition to a Capricus carrier and 3 Sagittars. 3 units of Brokir Thunderkin, a unit of 6, and 2 units of 3, all of them with Graviton blast cannons, in addition to a pair of Chthonian Berserk squads, 3 units of Einhir Hearthguard, we had 2 units of 5 and 1 unit of 10. Now, we don't have any enhancements on any of the calls, but I imagine we're going to be dropping a call into each of these, since the Einhir themselves are equipped with teleport crests, and we see rampart crests on the characters. We then have a unit of Hernkin Pioneers and a unit of Hernkin Jaegers. Now, what's interesting about this build is that a lot of times what we see with these Hearthband lists is that they focus very heavily on Hekaton land fortresses to follow up after the Einhir Hearthguard. Usually the play pattern is an early game engagement from the smaller units of 5 Einhir Hearthguard. They can clear out utility units and essentially require that the opponent comes back in and attacks you. Then you get to follow up with land fortresses or with the larger 10 model Hearthguard unit in order to really deliver the killing blow. In this case, we're doing so with Brokir Thunderkin, this big unit of 6 Brokir Thunderkin, potentially supported by the smaller units, in addition to Chthonian Berserks inside Sagittars. A little bit of a different play pattern, but something similar to what we've seen in the past. Now, heading over to Austria for the 50-player Salzburg Major. This was won by Fabian Huber, who was playing Thousand Suns, and a little bit of a different build. This was a Warp-Forged Cabal that was focused on Demon Princes, Winged Demon Princes, which is pretty cool to see. In this case, we were running 3 Winged Demon Princes. One of them had Warp Siphon, another one with Warp Cursed Rune Master for additional range on his ritual, and a Zangor Shaman. And those guys were buffing up a massive number of vehicles. There is a unit of Sekatar robots, 2 Forge Fiends, 3 Defilers, 1 Predator Annihilator that made up the vehicle pool for this list. Now, obviously, Warforged Cabal has a ton of support for vehicles, in addition to giving them one reroll to hit, wound, or damage. That improving to 1 reroll to hit, wound, and damage once you have Psykers nearby. And with those Demon Princes being able to spread out relatively quickly around all of the vehicles and buffing the ones that are necessary, that can happen pretty consistently. Now, you don't want to expose those guys too early because they're not the hardest thing in the world to kill, but a benefit of the list is that once you get to the mid or late game, you can play them a little aggressively because you are essentially stat checking out your opponent. The majority of your list is toughness 10, you have those toughness 11 Defilers, and everything's protected by strong save characteristics, so your opponent's anti-tank is going to be kind of overloaded when it comes to destroying the Winged Demon Princes. One thing that can often happen is if you're playing foot sorcerers, so things like mass Zangor Shamans, for example, or you're playing more rubric-focused sorcerers, is that your opponent's anti-infantry can easily target those and remove your access to Kabbalistic rituals towards the late game. However, that's much more difficult to do when your sorcerers are also essentially vehicle profiles. Now, we also, for utility, had a unit of Zangors as well as a unit of Zangor Enlightened, and that was it. Now, with that, we're going to head on over to the 70-player Thailand GT Summer. This was won by Pichayut Praiser Twit, who was playing a Grizzled Company detachment. In this case, focusing pretty heavily on infantry-based firepower. Now, we're running a Cadian command squad in addition to a Castellan. Those were going to dual attach into a unit of Cadian shock troopers. The Castellan gives you that sustained hits and the ability to fall back and shoot, which is helpful. We have Gaunt's Ghost, a pair of Militarum Tempestus command squads, in addition to a Rogaldorn commander. The Tempestus command squad is equipped with command rods, so they can have 2 orders applied to them at once, which is obviously helpful for Grizzled Company's ability to give you multiple orders for each of your officers. We then had 3 units of 10 Kazarken, alongside 3 units of 5 combat engineers. There were 2 Toroxes to deliver those guys into the fight, so we could scout those vehicles up, advance, disembark, and then deal some damage, potentially using Snap to It from the Master Vox in the Cadian command squad to reapply additional orders onto the Kazarken as they're disembarking. From there, we also had 2 units of 10 Militarum Tempestus Scions. These guys were going to attach in with the Tempestus command squads. They can deep strike in and deal some additional damage with their short-range shooting. So it was mostly ranks and ranks of these elite infantry, the elite like 3+ ballistic skill infantry, getting benefited by the Grizzled Company order effects. being able to get hit rerolls on the Tempestus Scions in addition to take aim thanks to the detachment ability, alongside also getting those wound rerolls that they themselves get, make this unit very popular, and the more I've been seeing recently, a more and more popular choice in Grizzled Company builds. Now we're going to stick with this event, the Thailand GT, and talk about the second place finisher, Yang Kieng Ong, who went 5-0 with Emperor's Children. Didn't end up taking first place due to tiebreakers, but still doing fairly well. Yang was playing a coterie of the Conceited List, focused around a single winged demon prince who's pledged to eternal servitude, so he's able to regenerate once per game upon death on a successful leadership check. We had 2 Lords Exultant as well as Lucius the Eternal. Following that up were a pair of Infractor squads for the Lord Exultants to hop into, a pair of Tormentor squads for utility, in addition to 2 Rhinos to carry those guys around, 3 Defilers, and a unit of Flawless Blades. No Noise Marines in sight. That's basically entirely being filled by the Defilers, which were all equipped with Hades Las Cannons, Excruciator Cannons, and Ectoplasma. I don't know whether or not the Flawless Blades were attached in with Lucius the Eternal. Lucius can't operate by himself. He gains lone operative and fights first when he's on his own. However, when he joins in with the Flawless Blades, he does improve their output with his own very impressive melee stat line, which can be benefited by the a critical 3s to wound, anti-everything in the game 3+, which allows them to punch through, especially stuff with a damage reduction, more consistently than they would by themselves. A lot of times you run into something like a Catan Shard or a Redemptor Dreadnought with Flawless Blades, and they go from 2 damage down to 1, and they actually end up bouncing because their attack volume is not massive. Lucius the Eternal can help you out in those situations. However, it is a lot of eggs in one basket. You end up creating this like 350-point brick, which can't be transported by anything and basically just has to wait to the late game. So I don't know necessarily if he did attach. That might be a matchup dependent thing. But otherwise, it was mostly the Defiler show here, and that, I guess, went well. Now, moving over to the 44-player Derg Doom 7, we can start talking about some Space Marine factions, starting with Colin Power playing Deathwatch. In this case, Colin was playing a Black Spear Task Force led by a Gravis Captain with Thief of Secrets, a Judiciar with Beacon Angelus, a Combi Weapon Lieutenant, as well as a Watchmaster with the Tome of the Ectoclades. We did have a big unit of Deathwatch veterans, 10 of them, with melee loadout to attach the Judiciar into. We had an Intercessor squad for the backline, 1 Eliminator squad for utility, 3 Fortis kill teams to provide that solid direct fire as well as indirect shooting, 2 Indomitor kill teams that could then be buffed up by 2 Incursor squads also in the list. Pretty classic stuff. And that moves us over to the Minsk Eternal GT being played in Belarus. This was a 32-player event and was won by Dmitry Sanchenko, who was playing Ultramarines. Now, this event did use differential scoring. In this case, Dmitry did drop a game in terms of raw victory point score, but he only lost by 5 points, which meant it ended up being a draw. In terms of differential, still ended up taking first place due to tiebreakers, and no other players had better tournament point scores on their profile. Now, in this case, Dmitry was playing a Blade of Ultramar detachment. This was led by Robute Gilliman. However, we also saw Uriel Ventress, a Combat Weapon Lieutenant, and a Gravis Armored Captain with Armor of Antoninus. We had a unit of Victrix Honor Guard for Uriel Ventress to hop into. He can grab them Deep Strike so you can Rapid Ingress and use him to deliver his Vect Aura to mess with enemy stratagem usage. Robute Gilliman can sit next to the Combi Weapon Lieutenant or the Gravis Captain to gain Lone Operative, and then he can buff the back line of shooting. That includes 2 Vindicators and 2 Repulsor Executioners, which can also be improved by Blade of Ultramar's ability to improve their survivability. We then have an Incursor squad for +1 to hit to make the double oath go a little bit farther, plus a Scout squad and an Intercessor squad for the backline. Not to mention Wardens of Ultramar for some additional utility. Now, moving on from there to our last Space Marine faction of the week, this was in the 45-player Heroes of the Mid-Table Spring GT, which ended up being won by Jordan Gallagher, who was playing none other than a Raven Guard Shadowmark Talon. This has been a really long time since we've seen a Raven Guard doing well. It feels like a full year, I think, since we've seen them last be meta. And this list will look familiar if you are familiar with the old versions of Shadowmark Talon. but this is the essentially Raven Guard specific version of a Vanguard Spearhead in the Space Marine faction. This includes Athan Sean, who gives you a free use of the up-down strat in the detachment, a jump pack captain, Caven Shrike, as well as a combo weapon lieutenant with Coronal Sucerant, which can give you a Vect aura. We have an Intercessor squad, in addition to 2 units of jump pack intercessors for some utility, 2 Eradicator squads, which are helpful alongside the up-down stratagem that the detachment uses. One thing that this detachment will often do is kind of try to threat overload with multiple infantry units all descending at the same time, and being able to drop Eradicator squads off of the table edges using strategic reserve is very helpful for that, in order to spot remove infantry and monster units so that the Centurion Devastator squad in the army doesn't have to spend all of its time doing that. Now, from there, we also have a jump pack Vanguard veteran squad, one of them equipped with Inferno pistols. We also have a second one equipped with Storm shields. The typical play pattern here is that you'll use the captain's unit to rapid ingress and then move up to attack. He jumps in with the unit of Storm shield equipped Vanguard veterans so they can be a little bit more resilient, and then he improves their strength characteristics. So when they're going into an oath target, they can be strength 6 with +1 to wound, meaning they're wounding most of the game on 4s with lethal hits. Now, Caven Shrike is the other attachment for the second unit. He has the Phobos keyword, so he allows that unit to benefit from all of the Phobos synergies that the detachment has. That includes the Feint and Thrust detachment, which gives you the ability to advance, shoot, and charge. So this unit, with Shrike's ability to either up, down, or just start on the battlefield in the open because of his, he grants them a lone operative effect, you can push the unit forward with advance, shoot, and charge. They have Inferno pistols, so they get up close to an enemy, and oftentimes what they'll do is they'll try to get up to something like the oath target and then shoot it to death with Inferno pistols before then charging into a second unit. And what this army will typically try to do is set up that combination on turn 1 or turn 2 so that you can 2-for-1 a Shrike's unit into your opponent and then rapid ingress the second unit the turn afterwards to then sort of hit them with a second brick of Vanguard veterans. So it's this 1-2 punch that opens up a lot of table space, which allows the other reserve units, like the Eradicators, for example, to jump in after them. In addition to that, we also had the Centurion Devastator squad. These guys are very classic in this build for their ability to use the up-down strat to go into reserve and then pop in off of a table edge. They could then use Stunning Fusillade to gain +1 ballistic skill and +1 AP, targeting enemies outside 12 inches. The Centurion Devastators naturally reroll hit rolls, so they're going to be hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s, and then they are twin-linked on their las cannon shots. So you're firing 6 full reroll AP4 D6 +1 damage attacks, essentially, plus all of their missile launcher attacks as well, which basically means you're going to be removing a heavy target essentially once per turn, as long as you have the command points to continuously fuel them. On top of that, we also have an Inceptor squad with Assault Bolters. These guys are useful for opening up that fight on turn 1. One thing that this army cannot typically do is, because it uses a lot of strategic reserve mechanics rather than deep strike mechanics, especially for units like the Eradicators and for the Centurion Devastators, it cannot reposition those units early. However, the Inceptors can. So if you are going second, you can target the Inceptors at the up-down strat, which puts them into strategic reserve, which then allows you to deep strike them at the bottom of the first turn, because deep strike can be brought in from in turn 1 or battle round 1, assuming that they began the game on the table. You can then use Stunning Fusillade on them to bring them to AP2 and hitting on 2s. You target the Oath of Moment target, and you can fish, because you're hitting on 2s, you can fish for sustained hits too, so you average more shots than you put in. They're twin-linked, and they're a strong AP characteristic at that point. They're also not hazardous, unlike the Plasma version of this unit, which means you aren't going to be losing models. So if you can fit a niche line of sight where you can see a target without having to expose your unit too much and get yourself outside 12 inches for the Stunning Fusillade to work, you can up down these guys, blow that target up on turn 1, and basically start clearing screens so units like Caven Shrike and your other infantry can start to make progress later on in the game. Now, obviously, you can also sort of do this as a 1-2 punch alongside Caven's unit, where Caven's unit's going to advance charge, push up the table, clear something, you drop the Inceptors at the same time, clear all that out, and then the next turn you come in with the Rapid Ingress Vanguard Veteran unit with the Captain, plus the Eradicators, plus the Centurion Terrain Devastators, and you just basically beta strike your opponent directly into the ground. This list is very maneuverable. It can deal tons of damage, and it's able to do so using so many reserve effects that it's very difficult without basically screening the entire board to prevent it from getting hits on what it really needs to. There's a reason that for a really long time this was peak meta Space Marines. However, after successive points nerfs, it was obviously brought in line and depowered very significantly. Now, moving over to the 11th Hour GT, this is a 29-player event being held in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This was won by Adrian Lopez, who is playing Adeptus Mechanicus, and an absolutely wild Strider, I guess, focused Adeptus Mechanicus list. This was using the Skitarii Hunter cohort detachment and includes Belisarius Call as the only character. We then have 2 units of Skitarii Rangers, 2 Servitor Battleclades for utility, so we have some OBSEC from the Skitarii Rangers, so we can try to OBSEC mid-board objectives in the early or mid-game. And then Servitor Battleclades are able to advance and perform actions, so they're very helpful utility units. We also have 1 unit of Sicarian Infiltrators as well as 2 units of Sicarian Ruststalkers for some both utility in the form of the Infiltrators, but also long throughout range melee in the form of the Sicarian Ruststalkers. And that is all in service of the fact that basically 90% of the damage of the army is coming from a grand total of 15 Dragoon profiles. That includes 3 units of 2 Iron Strider Ballistari, in addition to 9 Sidonian Dragoons with Taser Lances. Now, the big benefit here is the Bionic Endurance stratagem that gives a Sidonian unit a 5+ feel no pain. So these guys, with 3 of them stuck together, they're 21 wounds with an invuln save, with a baked-in stealth. They can also get a feel no pain, which can eventually push that to wounds count to essentially like 30. They have the natural ability to advance and charge, and there is a stratagem to improve their armor penetration characteristic as well. It is 2 command points, so I don't know how often you're going to be using that, but you do have it if you really need to. And these guys can essentially like absorb so much of the table. You also have Expedited Purge Protocol, which you can use on the Sicarian units to advance and charge, and the Ruststalkers gain their +2 advance and charge bonus when they're near battle line units, so those guys can use that to close the distance really quickly. So between 9 advancing and charging Sidonian Dragoons, in addition to a unit of Sicarian Ruststalkers, all hitting at the same time, you can very effectively jail your opponent out. And we've talked at length this video talking about Cult of Speed and how effective jail strategies are, and this detachment can do that extremely well. That creates a ton of table space that you can then use to just blast people away with the 3 units of Iron Strider Ballistari, all of those equipped with Cognis las cannons. You can also benefit on any of these attacks, obviously, with Ballistari's Call's reroll effect, which is great on the Dragoons, which have sustained hits too, but also can be good on the las cannon shots as well. Now let's talk about Imperial Knights for a sec. We're going to head on over to the 48-player ValleyCon 2026, which was being held in New Zealand. And this event was won by Chaos Space Marines, unsurprisingly, but in second place at 5-0 was Michael Stewart with an Imperial Knights Freeblade company. Now, this detachment has been getting a lot of popularity in the last couple of weeks. It grants Imperial Knights their 6+ feel no pain, which on a unit with a wounds count as monumental as they have, this goes a long way. It also gives them the ability to regenerate that wounds count as well, which can make them very sort of, I guess, inconsistently but randomly resilient. And when you compound that with units like Cerastus Knight Lancers that are already very difficult to kill, that can go pretty far. Now, in this case, Michael was playing an Astropos as well as a Lancer. He had a Knight Castellan with Mysterious Guardian. That lets you pick that guy up and then drop him somewhere else on the table. He can essentially uppy-downy himself in order to unlock novel lines of sight around the table, which is something incredibly powerful for a Knight Castellan, which tends to be kind of difficult to maneuver, but have pretty strong range damage output. We have a Knight Crusader with Hunter's Eye that allows that guy to gain Ignore Cover, which is helpful, especially on his Rapid Fire Battle Cannon, which comes in at only AP 1, as well as the Avenger Gatling Cannon at AP 2. Those low AP values really need that Ignore Cover to be helpful. And then, interestingly, a new little guy here, a Knight Destrier with Bringer of Justice. This gives this guy +2 melee attacks, as well as +1 to hit with those attacks. Now, the Knight Destrier was equipped with a pair of melee weapons, so that includes the Reaper Chainsword and Thundershock Spear. The benefit of those is that all of their base weapon profiles improve by 2 if you are taking no ranged attacks. So if you don't take a gun arm and you take only melee arms, that already increases your attack characteristic. That is then further improved by the Bringer of Justice enhancement for a total of +4 attacks and +1 to hit. So this guy hits on 2s with all of his attacks and can be swinging potentially up to 8 Thundershock Spear swings at Strength 12 AP3 D3 +3 damage Lance, or 9 Reaper Chainsword swings, which drops the lance off for that additional 1 attack. Actually, a legitimately impressive level of damage output. Now, in addition to that, the fact that this guy's very quick with a high base movement characteristic of 12, in addition to his additional plus D3 movement every time he goes to move. So he's basically 12 plus D3 move characteristic, I assume. I suppose, as long as he's not falling back. You can also use full tilt to give him +9 inches of movement, although he doesn't have the ability to charge afterwards, but it is good for setup. And being that fast allows you to use Strength from Exile, which is a reroll 1s to hit and wound as long as you are outside 9 inches of all other friendly units. Now, given the fact that this Destrier is going to be essentially running, potentially 15 inches up the table in addition to charging, or 24 inches if it's just advancing, in order to maneuver itself into position, it's very often going to be achieving that effect, and then you are essentially rolling up to 9 attacks, hitting and wounding most of the game on 2s, re-rolling. So that actually improves the efficiency or the reliability of this guy's profile absolutely through the roof. Very interesting little combination for the Knight Destrier there. Now, in addition to that, we were also running a unit of Inquisitorial Agents for some backline. So we have 5 total Titanic Knights, although the Destrier is like a Titanic Knight with an asterisk, I guess, in addition to 1 utility unit. You have this incredibly fast melee beat stick in the form of the Destrier, as well as a very solid, consistent range damage output in the Knight Crusader, plus the Cerastus Knight Atropos. The Lancer is very strong midboard control, and then you can support that with the Knight Castellan that can teleport around the flanks in order to spot remove specific enemies. With that, we're going to move to some of the really big results of the weekend, and we're going to start off with the Bay Area Open. This was a 161-player event. We already talked about it because we talked about the second place finisher, but it was won by Floof Cox from the Nexus Floof YouTube channel, and who went 6-0 and ended up winning the event using an Ascension Host Geneastealer Cult list. In this case, he was playing a Benefictus with the Assassination Edict for the benefit against character units, in addition to 2 standard Benefictus. The nice thing here is that you gain sustained hits 1 when you are coming out of reserve, and then you can also use Primed and Ready for improved critical effects. The Benefictus, in addition to providing good shooting on their own, also give you lethal hits, so you can be lethal, sustain, ignore cover when coming out of reserve with units like large Neophyte Hybrid squads. We then have a Nexus with Prowling Adjutant that gives him a D6-inch reactive move when enemies move up close to him. Since he's going to be a source of command point economy over the course of the game, it's good to keep that guy alive, especially if he's holding down your backline objective, so enemies rapid ingressing or something are going to have a tougher time actually pinning him down. We have a Primus with Chink in their armor to again grant lethal hits, so we can essentially bring him as what is effectively a 4th Benefictus. So we have 4 units that can also all be affected by that sustained lethal 5+ critical effect, plus a Reductus Saboteur for utility. Speaking of utility, we have an Auto Pistol Acolyte Hybrid squad to hold down the backline and again generate some command points. 3 units of Hand Flamer Acolyte Hybrids for disruption, so they can jump in on objectives, flamer down utility units, and get some damage in melee with their wound rerolls. We then have a grand total of 80 Neophyte Hybrids, 4 units of 20. Those guys all benefiting from that ignore cover sustained hits when they come out of reserve. Following that up, those guys are buffed by 3 Achilles Root Runners, which can give crossfire for +1 AP. All of those Root Runners are equipped with heavy mortars, 2 of them with Survey Augers, which allows you to apply ignore cover even on turns where you haven't come out of reserve, and the last one with a Spotter. You can kind of like start the chain a little bit more easily with the Spotter since he gets that +1 ballistic skill. We then have 3 units of Adelan Jackals for early game disruption, and a unit of Pure Strength Geneastealers. Those guys are helpful to both contest enemy objectives early and perform utility rolls, but also to clear out screening units so that you can drop the larger units like the Neophyte Hybrids or the Acolytes later on in order to actually clear out heavy units or take objectives. And with that, we move on to the largest result of the weekend at the almost 300-player Warhammer Open Dallas. This was won by Liam VSL, who's in the area to do his rematch game against Richard Siegler, which I'm excited about happening later today if you are watching this on Monday. He played a traditionally bizarre Reaper's Wager list. This is the classic Drukhari detachment that gives you reroll once they hit and introduces a wager mechanic where you start the game with Drukhari winning the wager, and as long as you are losing the wager, you are inspired, I guess, to reroll your ones to wound. Harlequin units begin the game losing the wager, therefore they reroll ones to wound, and if they ever destroy a unit, then the wager flips over to the other faction. So in this case, the big benefit of this is the ability to utilize that reroll once to hit to just massively improve the reliability of your attacks across the board, but there's also a couple stratagems that are important there, especially things like shorten the odds, which allows you to advance and charge. Now, in this case, Liam was playing a Drazar, Lady Malice, Lilith Hesperax, a Solitaire, as well as a Troop Master with Arch Raider. That gives him a Scout move for him and his unit, Scout 9 inches, which allows him to, in the early game, drop off a troop unit out of a Star Weaver. So we are playing 5 Harlequin Troopers in addition to their transport, so you can scout that unit up 9 and then go use it to destroy a utility unit or to threaten an objective, flip the objective, and flip the wager over to Drukhari. That then, if you do that towards the end of your turn, allows Drukhari to be losing the wager for the majority of your next turn, which gives them the reroll ones to wound until they destroy something. And then you have the Solitaire that can flip it back over. So you have a couple of activations in which you're able to flip the wager mechanic back and forth in order to gain those additional rerolls. It's not the end of the world if you don't end up benefiting from the rerolls, but it is a very nice consistency buff. Now from there, we also have a Cabalite Warrior Squad in addition to 2 units of Witches. There are 3 Venoms in the list, so we're going to be able to potentially combat squad all 3 of these units for a total of 6 OC2 utility squads, and then you can just disembark them and drop in another unit if you want to. There is a unit of Incubi that we could jump into with Drazar or with Lady Malice if we want to. Sometimes Drazar plays by himself just as a beat stick, but you don't necessarily need him to play with the Incubi if you don't want to. We then have a Chronos for Pain Token Regeneration, a big unit of Hellions for some pretty serious damage. There is a stratagem inside the detachment, Malicious Frenzy, to gain sustained or lethal hits, which you can benefit the Hellion unit pretty significantly with. We have a unit of 5 Incubi, 2 units of Reavers, alongside 2 units of heavy weapon Scourges. The Scourges are equipped with a combination of Dark Lances and Haywire Blasters. One unit has 4 Dark Lances, the other unit has 4 Haywire Blasters, and those, alongside the Mortal Wounds and the Heat Lance shooting from the Reavers, gives you some pretty solid ranged anti-tank, especially if you are benefiting from the wager, so you can reroll ones to wound on those anti-tank shots. And then from there are the transports that I mentioned earlier. 1 Star Weaver with a Harlequin Troop inside, plus 3 Venoms, all of the Venoms equipped with Splinter Cannons, the Star Weaver equipped with its characteristic Shuriken Cannons. This list is absolutely bizarre. A lot of times what we'll see is kind of skirmishing-focused units in addition to some very heavy hitters that are going to be benefited from advancing and charging, and things like that inside the Reaper's Wager detachment. So things like Talus Pain Engines get played a lot of times in this detachment. However, in this case, we are just basically focusing entirely on OC2 Disruption Infantry, just spreading all over the board, and I'm sure being able to accrue damage between things like the Devastating Wounds on the Troop Master and the Harlequin Troopers, in addition to the Devastating Wounds on the Scourges, for example, and being able to stack that together to actually remove heavy targets while keeping your opponent off balance and scoring, as is Liam's traditional game plan. And with that, those are all of the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks as well to Wicked Dicey and their Summer Slaughter event for sponsoring the video. Please come check them out. The link is in the video description, and I will be there streaming over the weekend, so you'll get to hang out with me, which is obviously the big draw. But also, thanks to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, whether that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.